Hi, I'm Mark, and today on Outside Views I want to talk about Brexit again. Surprise, surprise. Brexit driver Nigel Farage recently described Brexit as a failure. You might have seen my video on this, and a lot of Brits see it that way too. Only 9% of people in Great Britain consider their country's exit from the EU to be a success. This emerges from a survey published by the opinion research institute YouGov on Monday. On the other hand, almost two-thirds, with 62%, see Brexit as a failure, and the rest answered don't know or neither nor. 2006 adults in the UK were surveyed on May 17th and 18th. The question was, do you think Brexit has been a success or failure so far? There are differences in the assessment of what the reason for the failure is. While more than half of those surveyed, with 56%, believe that Brexit was doomed to fail from the start, a third, with 33%, still believe that the exit from the EU had the potential to be successful. But this has been gambled away by various governments. The Brexit champion and former leader of the UKIP party, Nigel Farage, recently made a similar statement about the governments. Looking back, only 31% of Britons now believe that the decision to leave with the referendum in 2016 was correct, while 56% believe it was a mistake. Regret about Brexit, also known as regret, is somewhat less pronounced among those who voted to leave, of course. Among the so-called leavers, 22% now believe they made a mistake, and that's more than ever before. However, almost two-thirds, with 65% of this group, do not regret this decision. The Sunday Times had already reported on the survey at the weekend. And it couldn't be any stranger. Nigel Farage, of all people, who did more than anyone else to bring about Brexit, has now issued a devastating verdict on the consequences of Britain's exit from the EU. I have to come back to this topic because of this survey. The longtime EU opponent and former leader of the Independence Party UKIP has concluded that his country has not really benefited from Brexit, economically speaking. Brexit has failed. That's what Farage really said. But of course, Farage does not mean that it would have been better to have stayed in the European Union at the time. For him, there's absolutely nothing wrong with the principle itself, which he advocated so vehemently. He simply assigns the blame for the failure of the project to the Tory government, which has handled everything miserably, and 33% do the same like Farage. Our politicians are just as useless as the commissioners in Brussels have always been, he said. Instead of using Brexit to boost the British economy, hopeless government policies have, on the contrary, driven many companies out of the country. And the situation at the borders hasn't improved either. As far as the record influx of foreigners, this time from outside the EU, is concerned. The Tories have pretty much let us down. They have completely disappointed us, he says. In fact, the mood has changed significantly since the 2019 general election, when Boris Johnson vowed to finally get Brexit done. Like Farage, most of his compatriots are increasingly coming across the negative consequences of Britain's departure from the EU. And in the last survey, 59% of Britons believed that their country is worse off than it was before it left the EU. But unlike Farage, more and more people see the exit itself as a mistake. And around a fifth of voters who voted in favor of Brexit in the 2016 referendum now regret the decision, but the majority is still thinking they did the right thing. But regretting it is no wonder, because none of the promises made in the Brexit campaign, in which Johnson and Farage played such a crucial role, have been fulfilled in recent years. The voters had been promised that their country, freed of all those EU shackles, would experience a fantastic new growth, a veritable national boom, and that countless billions of pounds would go to their own national healthcare system instead of to Brussels. That stopping migration for continental Europeans would result in higher wages for the lowest paid Brits, and that the cost of living in the UK would drop significantly after leaving the EU, and that democracy on the island would be reinvigorated by a return to greater national sovereignty. Instead, the British have slipped from one crisis to the next, and 5 prime ministers, all of the same party, have been at Downing Street number 10 in 7 years, and confidence in politics has noticeably decreased. And economic growth is stagnating, and Great Britain is currently in the last place among the industrialized nations of the G7. And more generally, it's lost ground on the international stage rather than finding the glorious new role that Boris Johnson once promised the people. At home, years of falling real wages have proved fatal for millions of Britons. The inflation rate is higher than in many EU countries, and the number of destitute keeps growing. Social welfare and charitable associations can hardly do justice to the rush of the needy. The healthcare system, which Brexit was supposed to cure, is in a crisis like never before. And London's Independent Office for Good Budgeting has predicted a 4% annual slump in Britain's economy because of Brexit. The Bank of England estimates that the economy had already lost around £30 billion in investment as a result of Brexit. Many companies have gone bankrupt because trade with continental Europe has collapsed for them. In recent days, 3 of the major UK car makers, that's Ford, Jaguar Land Rover and Stellantis, which also is owned by Fiat, Citroën and Peugeot, in addition to Vauxhall, have warned the UK government that they may be preparing to halt production in the UK. And Great Britain would be forced out of Britain if London did not rush to a new trade agreement with the EU. The core issue is that from next January, the companies would have to pay 10% tariffs on British exports to the continent if they did not use enough materials from the UK itself or from the EU, for example, because they bought expensive batteries from China. Such tariffs would also be a problem for the EU, but in Great Britain, they would directly threaten the future of domestic car production, which employs 182,000 people. Other problems are also becoming clearer. The negotiations about renewed intensive cooperation with the EU in the research area, for example in the Horizon project, are dragging on. And tourism from Europe is suffering, and in the opposite direction, British travellers have to be prepared for their fingerprints to be taken at the border crossing to the EU, and more waiting times, of course. British musicians and other artists who want to perform in the EU complain about a lot of bureaucratic hurdles. And school classes from the EU area who used to like to travel to the island stay away, if only because passports are required and not all children from the EU have passports. However, identity cards alone are no longer sufficient when entering Great Britain. And despite all this, Prime Minister Rishi Sunak insists that Brexit is generally a success and that it just needs a little more time to reap the rewards of independence. When asked what the major achievements of Brexit were, Sunak explained last week, somewhat tormented, that beer, for example, and hygiene items have become cheaper because they can now set VAT themselves. But talking about Brexit hardliners, I have got a small update on one of them I must not forget, so I put it in this video. Former British Deputy Prime Minister Dominic Raab, who resigned because of the allegations of bullying, no longer wants to run in the next general election. This was reported by the daily newspaper The Telegraph on Tuesday night, citing an exchange of letters between Raab and the chairman of his Conservative branch in the southern English county of Surrey. As the reason for his withdrawal from Parliament, Raab stated that the pressure that his young family was under because of his job. The next general election in the UK is scheduled for 2024. Raab resigned from his post as Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister, and with that Rishi Sunak's deputy, at the end of April. He was reacting to the results of an investigative report on his behavior in various ministerial posts in recent years. The report partially confirmed the allegations against Raab, and among other things, he is said to have reprimanded employees harshly or even announced consequences if he was not satisfied with their work or the answers to his questions. The Brexit hardliner Raab last held the position of Minister of Justice in addition to the role of Deputy Prime Minister. And so another one of the Brexit hardliners is gone now, and he's not the first, and I'm quite sure he's not the last. But all these Brexit talks by them, and the Brexit benefits. Beer and hygiene products are the big benefits of Brexit, while the rest of the country is suffering from the consequences seriously. If it wasn't so really sad for all those people that got dragged into this, it would just be funny, and it would really just be like a soap opera there. But and I know that many people comment like this, but there's one thing we all must not forget. This is also about people's lives who did not want what happened. And they, in many places, are suffering really hard because of this decision. And so we have to keep that in mind. This is not just a funny soap opera. There are real people, lives and livelihoods at stake with the whole thing, and not just the well-being or the fun of some millionaires and billionaires in office, although Sunak and his wife recently lost a lot of money, I read. I'll see you in my next video. I'll be back.